palace corridor was silent, impossibly still, as if the very air had been trained to obey. Every polished surface reflected centuries of order, every footstep measured, every whisper contained within invisible boundaries of duty. And then it happened. A voice, sharp, uncontrolled, and entirely public, cut through the calm like a blade. Camilla's words tore across the marble and tapestries, scattering the rhythm of centuries into shards of frozen disbelief. Maids froze mid-step. Clerks held quills suspended above parchment, and the guards simply stood, bound by oath and training, powerless to intervene. The sound was more than noise. It was a declaration, a rupture, an event that would not be unseen. Senior guard Jonathan Hale, decades of discipline behind him, felt the moment in his bones. Authority had overstepped his invisible lines, leaving him suspended between silence and duty. One wrong move could unravel everything. One word spoken could be treason. And yet, to remain still was to witness history bending under human impulse. In that corridor, tradition collided with recklessness, loyalty met moral peril, and the unspoken rules of the palace trembled. The echo of the shout lingered, and Jonathan knew what just occurred could never be forgotten. The corridor was silent, impossibly still, as if the air itself had learned to obey centuries of unspoken rules. Polished marble reflected the muted light from crystal sconces, and tapestries depicting victories long past absorbed the hush like sacred confessions. Every step, every movement, every measured breath belonged to the rhythm of discipline. And then it shattered. Camilla's voice erupted, sharp, uncontrolled, public. It cut through the corridor like a blade, slicing through ritual, protocol, and expectation. The sound did not belong here. Maids froze mid-step, silver trays trembling in their hands. Clerks hovered over quills, ink poised in suspended disbelief. Guards stiffened, eyes wide, muscles taut, bound by oath, unable to move or speak. Every echo ricocheted off the stone walls, magnifying the breach, embedding itself in the consciousness of every witness. Senior guard Jonathan Hale, decades of training and devotion behind him, felt the moment deep in his bones. His oath demanded silence. His conscience demanded action. Authority had been wielded without restraint. To speak, to intervene, was to risk everything. To remain silent was to bear witness to violation. And so he stayed, rigid, disciplined, a sentinel caught between duty and moral peril. Camilla stormed past, each step striking the marble like command. The echo lingered, embedding itself into the very architecture of the palace, reminding all present that power without restraint is both terrifying and absolute. Jonathan noted the trembling hands of attendants, the slight misalignment of paintings, the subtle ripple of unease in every posture. Every detail became evidence of a breach that could never be erased. He recalled the code of conduct for royal protection: absolute loyalty, absolute discretion, absolute silence. And yet the moment defied all precedent. The walls, polished and ornate, once symbols of order, now felt like the weight of history pressing down, demanding reckoning. The moral calculus was impossible. He could neither act nor ignore. Jonathan's hand rested lightly on the ceremonial baton, a symbol of authority and promise. Its weight grounded him, yet the tension coiled within his chest like a living thing. The corridor emptied slowly, the world outside resuming a measured rhythm, but nothing felt restored. The silence was no longer neutral. It was charged with consequence. Each breath, each heartbeat measured, each shadow, each reflection catalogued. The memory of the outburst, its uncontrolled authority, pressed against him. The palace, with all its history and ritual, had been breached. The rules he upheld were insufficient for this moment. And yet he would carry the truth silently, fully aware that silence itself may now be a betrayal. Jonathan stepped into the adjoining antechamber, doors closing softly behind him. The corridor, now empty, gleamed under filtered sunlight. Marble, tapestries, brass, and glass bore silent witness to human fragility and moral conflict. He paused, eyes scanning, mind recording. Every subtle tremor, every hint of unease, catalogued and memorized. He understood that this moment, this breach, would ripple outward, unseen but indelible. Time stretched in suspended awareness. Authority had overstepped. But he remained steadfast, a lone observer bearing witness. The palace exhaled, resuming its rhythm, but the echo of the shout persisted. He knew that to forget would be to betray not only his oath, but the very institution he had dedicated his life to protect. The camera drifted along the corridor, capturing the interplay of light and shadow, the glint of polished surfaces, the frozen tableau of human reaction. Each reflection, each echo, each subtle tremor confirmed what Jonathan already knew. The line had been crossed, and it could not be uncrossed. The palace itself held its breath. Jonathan Hale, senior guard, oath-bound, conscience-aware, stepped forward. The silence he now carried was not passive. It was deliberate, vigilant, and charged with responsibility. He would witness. He would remember. He would endure. The corridor, the palace, and its history demanded nothing less. The echo of the corridor's outburst still lingered in Jonathan Hale's mind as he moved to the palace's inner precincts. Silence had returned to halls, but not the same silence as before. It was heavier, layered with awareness. Every step he took was deliberate, measured, a reminder of the decades of discipline that had molded him. He did not speak, for to speak now would be to invite scrutiny, suspicion, or worse. Yet his thoughts moved faster than his feet could carry him, cataloging, analyzing, anticipating. Jonathan had not become senior guard by chance. His training had begun long before the polished floors and ceremonial corridors, in a barracks where commands were given with precision and consequences were immediate. He had learned to read movement before it occurred, to anticipate threats invisible to the untrained eye. Each drill, each exercise, each repetition was another layer of instinct. The code of royal protection was not a document to him. It was a living guide, etched into muscle memory, tempered in years of discipline, tested by countless rehearsals of loyalty under pressure. The palace itself was a classroom and a crucible. He knew every patrol route, every post, every blind corner where intrusions could occur. He understood the ritual of footsteps, the cadence of guards moving in formation, the subtle rhythm of a building designed to both protect and impress. Authority and obedience were not abstract concepts here. They were law, tradition, and the sinew that held centuries of monarchy together. In the quiet of the guardroom, Jonathan examined the logs, meticulously kept, each entry a testament to the machinery of order. Shift changes, ceremonial duties, inspection notes, they all told a story of continuity and precision. Yet today, something felt off. A report had been returned and signed. A patrol route subtly altered. A record that did not align with the patterns he had memorized over years. The anomalies were small, almost imperceptible, but they did not escape him. Every instinct honed over decades recognized these irregularities as early warning signals. The system designed to protect the crown was still functioning, but now, perhaps, it was protecting something else. The air in the guardroom was thick with anticipation and subtle tension. The hum of fluorescent lights, a mechanical pulse that underscored a human caution in the room. Jonathan's mind traced a chain of command, the consequences of disclosure and the risks of inaction. He understood the unspoken rules. The Crown security apparatus tolerated mistakes, but never moral lapses. And this breach, Camilla's shout, was neither mistake nor routine. He walked through the training courtyard, observing young guards executing drills with precise cadence. The echo of boots on stone reminded him of the rhythm that had shaped his life. Discipline first, loyalty always. The instructors had drilled. Do not act without authority. Do not speak without cause. He saw the same lessons etched into the posture of each recruit, the subtle rigidity of their shoulders, the tension in their hands, the unwavering focus of their eyes. These were the foundations of order, the invisible scaffolding of monarchy. Jonathan's own history played out in contrast. He had joined the Guard as a young man, eager, disciplined, devoted to principles larger than himself. Over decades, he had learned the subtle art of discretion. He understood that silence was not mere compliance. It was power, protection, and, sometimes, survival. Yet in the corridors of this palace, silence had taken on a new, dangerous quality. It could no longer simply preserve order. It might conceal wrongdoing, shield abuse, and protect impulsive authority from scrutiny. He returned to the archival wing, where centuries of protocol manuals lay neatly stacked in polished cabinets. Dust motes floated through shafts of light, catching the edges of leather-bound volumes and gilded titles. Jonathan traced his fingers over the embossed covers. Every regulation, every procedural note, every ceremonial instruction had been meticulously documented, preserved through decades of oversight. Yet the words on the pages felt distant from the human reality he had witnessed that day. Authority could bend, break, or ignore these rules, and the guards, trained to enforce them, were left to navigate the gap between written law and lived power. Jonathan paused before a sealed report, its wax stamp unbroken, but he noted the faint indentation beneath. Evidence that it had been handled, reviewed, yet not processed. Subtle shifts like these were the palace's quiet signals, the breadcrumbs of control. The system was still operational, but had begun to flex in unexpected ways, bending around the unrestrained force he had witnessed. In this environment, vigilance became not just a duty, but a moral imperative. He retraced his patrol routes in thought, visualizing the movements of staff, visitors, and guards. Every corridor, every doorway, every stairwell held its own rhythm, its own vulnerabilities. He recognized patterns. The way aides moved quickly through the service wings, the timing of ceremonial rehearsals, the habitual pauses at key observation points. All of it now had to be filtered through a new lens, one where discretion might collide with truth. The institutional knowledge he possessed was both a shield and a burden. Every anomaly was cataloged mentally, cross-referenced with past experience, weighed against protocol, and considered in terms of potential risk. Even minor irregularities, misfiled logs, subtle changes in patrol assignments, quietly rerouted messages, became evidence in the growing mosaic of concern. The palace, which once appeared a bastion of absolute order, revealed itself as a living organism, capable of adaptation, concealment, and manipulation. Jonathan's internal calculations were interrupted only by the quiet, methodical routines of his colleagues. Guards marched in formation for inspection, polished boots striking floors in measured cadence. Maids and clerks carried out tasks with practiced efficiency, a choreography learned over years, yet always under the unyielding gaze of authority. Observation became second nature. He noted small glances exchanged, hesitant gestures, and subtle hesitations. Each was a thread connecting human behavior to institutional structure. Hours passed in deliberate movement. Jonathan examined personnel rotations, cross-checked logs, and reviewed ceremonial schedules. Each small task was a mental exercise in vigilance. The crown depended on more than rules written on paper. It depended on interpretation, discretion, and a willingness to act when the system itself could not guarantee justice. And the recent breach, the shout, the rupture of protocol, had created a moral fault line running to the palace's operational integrity. He cataloged irregularities, noting the alter route of midnight patrol, a clerk's misfiled report, the reassignment of a low-ranking aide. Small things, almost invisible to others, yet impossible to ignore for a man trained to see order in every detail. It was a puzzle, each piece a potential signal of wider disruption. Jonathan's mind worked methodically, a quiet engine running beneath the surface of routine, discerning patterns where none were apparent to the untrained eye. In the solitude of his post, he reflected on the duality of his role, enforcer tradition and observer of human imperfection. Authority and restraint existed in delicate balance. One moment, the system could function flawlessly. The next, it could bend, break, and shield the wrong impulses from correction. And in this tension, Jonathan realized the magnitude of his responsibility. He was not merely a guard. He was a keeper of continuity, a silent witness to what could not yet be spoken aloud. As night descended over the palace, lights flickering along corridors, Jonathan completed his rounds with measured precision. The building hummed with ritual and routine, yet beneath it lay the unresolved tension of human imperfection. He understood that the recent outburst was not an isolated event. It was a signal, a reminder that vigilance must extend beyond duty into conscience, beyond protocol into moral judgment. He returned to the guardroom, notes and observations committed to memory. He reviewed the day's anomalies, the unsigned report, the shifted patrol routes, the subtle hesitation of staff. Each became evidence, silently building a case for awareness, for discernment, for readiness to act when the system faltered. The palace itself seemed to wait, holding its breath, anticipating the choices of those sworn to uphold it. Jonathan's reflection was clear. The crown's protection was not simply a matter of rules, tradition, or command. It was an ongoing act of moral responsibility. Authority could overreach, rules could bend, and silence could be weaponized. And in this delicate balance, the guard must navigate the impossible, preserving order while confronting truth. The night deepened, shadows lengthening across marble and tapestries. The palace slept in measured rhythm, unaware of the fissures growing within its walls. Jonathan Hale remained vigilant, cataloging, observing, and preparing for the day when discretion would no longer suffice. The first crack in the system had appeared. A sealed report returned and signed, and he understood that this was only the beginning. The corridors of the palace had regained their ordered rhythm, yet the tension that had erupted days earlier still hung in the air, subtle but unrelenting. Jonathan Hale moved through them with measured steps, every sense alert, every glance cataloged. Authority, he knew, was not always present in the person commanding. It often manifested through the unseen weight of expectation, protocol, and unspoken consequences. And today, that weight pressed heavier than ever. He was summoned to the inner council chamber, a room rarely entered except for formal briefings or extraordinary matters. The chamber's polished mahogany panels gleamed under low, solemn lighting. Portraits of past sovereigns stared from their frames, each a silent observer to human frailty and the exercise of power. The chamber was empty, yet he knew he was not alone. Authority was here, not in figure, but in principle, exerted by intermediaries who carried messages of compliance, loyalty, and caution. A clerk opened the door and motioned him inside. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood, wax, and the faint tang of tension. A senior aide, speaking softly, outlined the purpose of the summons, a reminder of loyalty, discretion, and the consequences of misinterpretation. No direct accusation was made. The words hovered instead as implication. Camilla's authority was felt without presence, carried by protocol enforcers, administrators, and ceremonial intermediaries. Every phrase was precise, loaded with meaning, and every pause calculated. Jonathan listened, absorbing each word with unwavering composure. The room itself seemed to narrow around him, shadows stretching across the polished floor, emphasizing the moral perimeter he now occupied. The unspoken rule was clear. Authority demanded silence. Speak, and you could imperil career, reputation, or even liberty. Remain silent, and you preserve duty, but at the cost of conscience. The collision of principles was imminent, and he sensed the chamber had become both battlefield and courtroom. Midway through the session, the first test arrived, not as confrontation, but as observation. A subtle question about procedure was posed, phrased in such a way that misinterpretation would seem natural. Jonathan responded with calm precision, choosing every word with care, neither overstepping nor yielding. His tone was measured, lawfully rooted, his phrasing reflecting the oath he had sworn. The subtlety was essential. This was not argument but assertion. Authority had demanded compliance, yet he reframed the situation with clarity. Actions mattered more than fear, truth more than intimidation. Silence followed his words. The chamber's air seemed to still, anticipation pressing against the polished panels. Intermediaries shifted slightly, eyes measuring, calculating. The moral impact of his reply, delivered without emotion yet imbued with the weight of decades of disciplined observation, had reframed the incident. Authority could no longer assume unquestioned dominance. It had encountered a measured restraint, grounded in principle. Outside, corridors remained calm, but the palace had begun to divide quietly. Word of what had been said traveled through whispers, careful glances, and the subtle circulation of messages. The implications were immediate yet unspoken. A line had been drawn, and it could not be erased. Jonathan, aware of this ripple, continued his movements with the same precision as always, cataloging reactions, noting posture, gestures, and the tiniest traces of tension. The palace, though outwardly serene, was charged with moral electricity. As he moved through ceremonial halls later that day, Jonathan reflected on the collision he had just navigated. Authority had demanded silence, yet his measured, lawful response had created a quiet fissure in the structure. The moral calculus remained delicate. To assert too much could be deemed insubordination. To yield entirely could be complicity. His decision balanced principle and procedure, restraint and revelation. The weight of the day pressed further as he returned to the guardroom. Each small movement of colleagues was now laden with meaning. A nod held a question. A glance contained speculation. A hesitation implied knowledge. The palace had begun to recalibrate subtly around the moral assertion he had made. It was a quiet shift, imperceptible to most, but Jonathan observed it with the trained eyes of a man who understood how power moved when challenged. Late into the evening, he reviewed his mental notes. Interactions, reactions, and procedural adherence across the palace. Minor anomalies, previously dismissed, now appeared significant. Tasks completed out of sequence, slight deviations in ceremonial routine, reassigned personnel. Each hinted at an institution adjusting quietly to a boundary that had been asserted but not yet codified. The system, designed to maintain order, had encountered its first test in years, and Jonathan had been its fulcrum. Through the night, the palace's rhythm continued. Footsteps echoed softly in corridors. The hum of air systems filled empty chambers, and the muted whispers of attendants suggested subtle recognition of the shift in authority. Jonathan, solitary in observation, understood that the true measure of loyalty was not in unquestioned obedience, but in disciplined judgment, exercised precisely when necessary. His reply had reshaped the perception of compliance, introducing a moral dimension that authority could not easily dismiss. In the pre-dawn light, he walked the ceremonial stairwell, tracing each step, noting every reflection in the polished surfaces. Shadows played along the walls, exaggerating lines and angles, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. Jonathan's focus remained unwavering. Each shadow, each glint of light, was cataloged for patterns, for shifts, for early warning signs of change. The palace, though outwardly unchanged, was subtly realigning. Jonathan paused at the top of the staircase, observing a distant aide adjusting ceremonial items. The smallest gestures had significance. Each microaction confirmed that the ripple of his assertion had reached every corner of duty, authority, and discretion. He understood that this moment, this quiet confrontation, would resonate far longer than any shouted command. Authority demanded silence, yes, but principle demanded measured assertion, and the two had now collided. By mid-morning, the palace began to function as usual, yet the echoes of moral collision remained. Jonathan continued his rounds, precise, observant, cataloging, ensuring that every deviation was recorded mentally and every sign of adjustment noted. Authority, for the first time in years, had encountered resistance without overt confrontation. The consequences were subtle but undeniable. As daylight filtered through the tall windows, Jonathan reflected on the reality of loyalty within the palace. It was not blind obedience, but the careful negotiation of principle, discretion, and responsibility. His measured reply had shifted the invisible balance of power. Authority had been tested, principles had been asserted, and the palace had quietly acknowledged that lines existed, even if unspoken. The corridors remained polished, the guards remained disciplined, the staff carried on with precision. Yet beneath the surface, subtle fractures had begun to form, guided by the silent assertion of law, oath, and conscience. Jonathan understood. This was only the beginning. Authority could no longer assume that silence equaled compliance. The corridors of the palace had returned to their measured rhythm, but silence no longer carried innocence. Every footstep, every echo of conversation, now bore the weight of consequence. Jonathan Hale moved deliberately, each stride cataloging anomalies, noting reactions, recording behavior that once would have been overlooked. The outburst, the collision of authority and duty, had left traces, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. In the dim light of the archival wing, Jonathan examined sealed files retrieved from the depths of history. Dust-coated ledgers, yellow correspondence, and wax-stamped reports were evidence of centuries of oversight. Yet tonight, they felt different. Each document carried not only instruction, but expectation. And in the margins of some long-forgotten letters, he found traces of deliberate omissions, instances where authority had overstepped, where order had been preserved at the expense of truth. The revelation was quiet but profound. What was recorded, once considered mere protocol, now held moral gravity. Jonathan traced the edges of one particularly well-preserved file, its seal broken with care, revealing the time-stamped record of the corridor incident. The notation was precise. Names, times, positions, all meticulously observed. But this was more than routine documentation. This was accountability. Authority had assumed control, but the record refused erasure. The weight of truth, once dormant, now pressed against the structure of ceremony itself. He reflected on the implications. Every record, every observation, every note made by his hand or those of past guardians now had the power to shape perception. The palace, a fortress of tradition, suddenly revealed its vulnerability. The truth could no longer be contained. Hidden correspondence indicated a history of similar outbursts, long buried beneath layers of deference, carefully managed to avoid scandal. Authority had been unchecked for generations, but each document was a reminder that discretion could not fully silence reality. Jonathan's hands hovered over a sealed envelope, its wax warm from recent handling. It contained observations from aides who had witnessed subtle deviations in protocol, shifted patrol routes, incomplete logs, and hesitations in ceremonial procedure. The content was mundane in isolation, yet when compiled with other anomalies, a pattern emerged. The institution had been bending around uncontrolled authority, preserving appearance over principle. And now, for the first time in memory, the weight of recorded truth demanded acknowledgement. Through the palace, conversations had slowed. Attendants moved deliberately, wary of the gaze of documentation. One misstep could trigger scrutiny, and scrutiny now carried the potential for exposure. Jonathan felt the gravity of the moment. Authority had been asserted without restraint, but the institution itself had safeguards embedded over centuries: records, timestamps, witnesses. The collision of history and human impulse was now undeniable. Hours passed in methodical observation. Jonathan cataloged the day's subtle irregularities. Documents left unsigned, correspondence quietly redirected, ceremonial items handled with unusual care. Each anomaly became a thread connecting past breaches to present tension. He realized that the palace's order, long perceived as unbreakable, was contingent on the integrity of those willing to document, observe, and remember. Without such vigilance, unchecked authority would always prevail. In the dim glow of the late afternoon, he reviewed internal memoranda. Lines carefully drafted to maintain appearances now revealed the deliberate suppression of truth. Reports on conduct, minor incidents, and deviations from protocol were quietly archived, their significance obscured by bureaucracy. And yet, juxtaposed against the record of the corridor incident, they illuminated a consistent pattern. Moments of human excess had been tolerated, hidden, or mitigated through silence. Jonathan reflected on his own role. The statement he had delivered during the confrontation, measured, lawful, grounded in oath, was now formally recorded, time-stamped, and witnessed. For the first time, the palace's internal mechanisms were set in motion by documentation, not by spectacle. Truth, one ephemeral and fragile, had been made tangible. Authority could no longer rely solely on intimidation or presence. A record existed, and with it, the moral weight of accountability. As dusk fell over the palace, shadows deepened along corridors, stretching across polished floors and painted panels. The building itself seemed aware, as if every brick, every pane of glass, carried the memory of breaches past and present. Jonathan walked silently, cataloging patterns, noting the subtle adjustments in staff behavior, observing how the institution adapted under the pressure of recorded truth. Each observation reinforced a singular realization. Concealment was impossible when vigilance was applied, when documentation carried moral as well as procedural weight. In quiet reflection, Jonathan recognized the irony. Authority, wielded without restraint, had thought itself absolute, yet it was a measured, law-bound record of a single witness, himself, that now exerted control over behavior, shaping the palace's response without confrontation. The corridors were orderly, the staff compliant, and the routines uninterrupted, yet the moral equilibrium had shifted. Authority was constrained not by command, but by the enduring weight of observation and record. Night descended, and Jonathan retreated to his quarters, though sleep eluded him. The palace, quiet yet alive with latent tension, had revealed the enduring power of documentation. Each note, each record, each time-stamped observation held influence far beyond its immediate purpose. Hidden in plain sight, truth had become a force, and he, bound by oath and conscience, had ensured it would not be ignored. The palace exhaled into darkness, ceremonially serene, yet beneath the polished surfaces and gleaming corridors, consequences had begun to ripple outward. Authority had been challenged not by rebellion or spectacle, but by the quiet assertion of recorded fact. And Jonathan understood that the final reckoning, the full impact of these documented truths, had yet to unfold. The palace breathed with a semblance of normalcy, though the echoes of disruption lingered quietly in polished corridors. Jonathan Hale moved with measured precision, observing ceremonial routine's resume, noting how staff, guards, and aides adjusted their actions to reflect restored order. There was no spectacle, no fanfare, no overt acknowledgement of what had occurred. Authority remained, but it had been quietly constrained, tempered by protocol and moral oversight. The day's first light revealed attendants returning to their positions with deliberate care. Every gesture, every movement, now carried subtle adherence to boundaries reaffirmed by the recent events. Jonathan observed without interruption. Maids arranging silverware with precise symmetry, clerks cross-checking ledgers twice, guards maintaining posture sharper than before. The palace itself seemed to recognize that the equilibrium had shifted, recalibrated around restraint and responsibility rather than dominance. Within the inner chambers, roles were clarified, responsibilities realigned, and ceremonial hierarchies reinforced. Staff who had hesitated or faltered in past weeks now moved confidently, guided by renewed clarity. Authority, once unchallenged and absolute, now operated within visible parameters established by centuries of law and, more recently, by the single measured assertion of duty Jonathan had delivered. He walked through corridors, cataloging subtle signs of restored order. The gleam of marble floors reflected disciplined footsteps, shadows aligned with symmetry, tapestries undisturbed, documents carefully logged and secured. Authority remained, but it no longer overreached. Camilla's presence, once commanding and unchecked, was now tempered by rules she could not ignore. The palace had endured without upheaval, yet the lesson was indelible. Boundaries could be reasserted without spectacle, and power could be balanced by principle. Jonathan paused in the ceremonial hall, watching guards rehearse their formations. Every motion was precise, disciplined, a reflection of training reinforced not by fear, but by conscious adherence to rules. He understood that the restoration of order required no triumph, no dramatic confrontation. It was quiet, deliberate, and morally grounded, a realignment of responsibility rather than rewriting of authority. In his private reflections, Jonathan considered his own place in this restored structure. He would not be celebrated, nor punished. His duty had been fulfilled, his silence no longer required, and yet he carried the knowledge of what had transpired. The crown, the palace, and the institution had endured because order had been quietly restored through adherence to its oldest and most enduring rules. Even Camilla's authority, once exercised without constraint, now moved within these same boundaries. She maintained command, yet her actions were observed, recorded, and guided by principles she could no longer ignore. Balance had returned, not through dominance, but through the restraint and fidelity of those sworn to uphold the institution. The corridors of the palace, polished and ceremonial, carried an almost imperceptible tension, a quiet reminder that authority must always be tempered, that order is preserved not by fear, but by disciplined adherence to principle. Jonathan walked among these shadows and reflections, noting every subtle adjustment, every nuanced compliance. His presence, quiet but vigilant, ensured that lessons learned would endure beyond immediate observation. As ceremonial routines resumed throughout the palace, Jonathan's gaze lingered on the details, the symmetry of guard formations, the alignment of documents, the precise cadence of footsteps echoing in marble halls. Each reflected the restoration of order, a harmony carefully maintained without fanfare. Authority had been constrained, yet preserved. Power had been checked, yet respected. The weight of past breaches, the echo of uncontrolled outbursts, and the presence of moral assertion lingered beneath the surface, Subtle yet undeniable. The palace had endured, its structure intact, its legacy preserved, and yet it had learned that order is most resilient when grounded in discipline, law, and the quiet vigilance of those sworn to uphold it. Jonathan's final inspection of the inner chambers revealed a palace reconciled with itself. Procedures were reinforced, boundaries reaffirmed, and conduct aligned once more with centuries of tradition. His duty, carried out without spectacle, had restored equilibrium without rewriting history. The corridors, tapestries, and polished marble stood witness to a quiet triumph, the resilience of order, guided by principle rather than fear. The palace, bathed in morning light, seemed at peace. Marble floors gleamed, corridors whispered with careful footfalls, and the ceremonial rhythm resumed as though the events of days past had been nothing more than a shadow passing through time. Yet silence, now, was no longer fragile. It had been tempered, strengthened, made purposeful by the truths recorded, observed, and preserved. Jonathan Hale moved through this quiet world with an awareness sharpened by responsibility, a consciousness of duty that transcended mere protocol. True loyalty, he reflected, is rarely spoken aloud. It is not the swift compliance to authority or the unquestioning execution of commands. It is a careful preservation of principle, the recognition that power unrestrained can threaten even the most venerable institutions. The guard's oath, once a formality, now resonated with deeper meaning. Protection of the crown required more than obedience. It demanded discernment, courage, and the willingness to act once, decisively, when the moment mattered most. Jonathan walked to the grand corridors, observing the subtle choreography of palace life. Attendants arranged ceremonial items with precise care. Guards maintained formation with exacting discipline. Every movement was ritualized, deliberate, and yet beneath the surface, each step now carried awareness of moral boundaries that had been quietly reinforced. The events of the corridor, the recorded truths, and the silent assertion of principle had created a framework no overt action could dismantle. The crown itself, ancient and enduring, relied on such invisible guardians to endure the tests of human error. He paused in the shadow of a vaulted archway, sunlight filtering across a centuries-old tapestry. The faces woven into the fabric, sovereigns and courtiers of generations past, seemed to watch, silent witnesses to the ongoing experiment of human authority and restraint. Jonathan understood that these walls had seen countless challenges to order, moments when authority had been exercised without discipline, and yet the palace had endured because those willing to uphold principle had acted, even quietly, even once. The corridors whispered with memory. Every echo of boots, every subtle shift of a curtain, every glint of polished metal carried reminders of the delicate balance between obedience and conscience. Jonathan's own words, recorded in the formal channels of the palace, had become part of that legacy. They were not triumphalist declarations, but measured statements of truth, documented and witnessed. In them, he had codified a moral line that no authority could cross without consequence. He reflected on the paradox of silence, how it can protect, preserve, and conceal. Silence, wielded without thought, can perpetuate injustice. Silence, applied with conscience, can safeguard institutions, uphold law, and preserve integrity. Within the palace walls, Jonathan had learned this lesson firsthand. His measured restraint, his deliberate documentation, and his unwavering adherence to principle had ensured that order and morality coexisted. Authority remained, but now constrained by the unyielding weight of law, history, and conscience. As the day unfolded, he moved past ceremonial halls where routine resumed with quiet dignity. The palace continued its centuries-old rhythm, steps echoing, papers logged, doors closing softly, conversations carefully measured. Yet beneath the apparent calm, Jonathan knew the structures of power had been subtly realigned. Authority was no longer unchecked. Responsibility was no longer abstract. Discipline now carried moral weight, and silence was no longer neutral. It was deliberate, protective, and enduring. The reflection of light on marble floors reminded him of the moral clarity that had been required to restore balance. The crown's endurance depended not on spectacle, nor on dominance, nor on fear. It depended on those willing to uphold the law, speak truth once when necessary, and accept the consequences. History, he realized, is shaped less by grand pronouncements than by quiet acts of conscience that ripple outward through time. Jonathan paused by a window overlooking the palace grounds. The gardens, meticulously arranged, stretched into perspective as if echoing the order restored within the walls. Trees, paths, and fountains adhered to geometry, reflecting centuries of care and attention. So, too, had the palace learned its own lesson. Restraint, principle, and quiet vigilance maintain order more reliably than force or unchecked authority ever could. He understood, finally, that this lesson was eternal, repeating through generations. The crown never speaks aloud its rules of moral vigilance, its unrecorded tests, its invisible trials. Yet these moments, often unobserved, define the endurance of institutions. Authority may demand silence, but conscience demands action. Loyalty may require discretion, but preservation of legacy demands courage. Jonathan walked the corridors one final time, each step a meditation on the responsibility carried by those sworn to serve. The palace, serene, gleaming, disciplined, would endure because its guardians understood that power without conscience corrodes even the most ancient walls. His role, though invisible to public, was now part of that ongoing story. The quiet enforcement of principle, the measured exercise of authority, and the preservation of truth in service of legacy. Silence returns to the palace, but it is no longer fragile. The narrator leaves the audience with final reflection, hinting at the unseen moments when loyalty, conscience, and principle intersect, and history quietly listens.